Let's gear up for what's next in micromobility. Please welcome to the stage our moderator, Dr. Levi Tilleman from Wired. He'll be joined by Tarani Duncan, micromobility consultant, Dr. Tarek Trivedi of UCLA Health, Yu-Win Poon of Spin, and Dmitry Shavalenko of Tortoise. And hopefully they will not run me over.
Go for it.
We're good.
Welcome.
All right.
Hi.
Let me give this to you. Great, thank you. Well, first of all, thank you very much, AutoMobility LA, for having us here today. And I also want to extend a special thank you to the LA Electric Unicycle Games, which loaned me that sweet wheel that I rode in on.
At the end, yeah.
My name is Levi Tilleman, and some of you may have read a book that I wrote called The Great Race, The Global Quest for the Car of the Future. And sometimes when I talk about the Great Race, I talk about it as a history of policy-led innovation in the automotive sector. But in a very real way, it's also a history of increased efficiency throughout automotive history. It starts in a workshop rented by Henry Ford before it moves to the assembly lines of Detroit that are literally thousands of times more efficient. After that, it migrates across the Pacific Ocean to Japan, where companies like Toyota pioneered the Toyota production system and just-in-time manufacturing. Eventually, it arrives in the present day, where modern-day assembly lines are massively roboticized and massively automated. Well, today, there is an analogous transformation taking place on the consumer side of the automotive world. Increasingly, Americans are choosing not to drive themselves in their own cars, and instead share vehicles with strangers, thus filling up empty seats. The efficiency implications of this are huge. We have come a long way since Henry Ford. But in an era of climate emergency, we need to ask ourselves, can we do better? And the answer is a resounding yes. One of the best ways to do better is through micromobility. And I'm going to explain why with a few slides that I put together for Wired magazine about a year ago. So the first reason is that micromobility just uses fewer resources, about 1% the resources of a traditional automobile. Because of that, it's much, much cheaper than your standard electric car. Again, about 1% the cost. When it comes to fueling micromobility, the cost is also about 1 to 2% as much as your standard automobile. It also goes much farther on a given unit of energy, about 100 times further than your standard internal combustion engine vehicle. Because of that, micromobility answers so many of the challenges of the 21st century. And we are honored today to have some of the vanguard of the micromobility revolution here with us to talk about this unfolding transformation. So with that, I'd like to walk down our panel and just ask everyone to introduce themselves. Let's start with Tyranny. Tyranny, you have been involved in the micromobility space longer than most of us in this room even knew what micromobility was. So can you tell us a little bit about your background and where you come from? And
Yeah, totally. So I'm a product and operations executive with a background in shared mobility and last mile logistics. I'm currently consulting for companies like Zoba, Electric Feel, and also Tortoise, who's on the stage with us today. Teleoperations and autonomy, more on that later. This is a really interesting time, like you were saying, the largest shift in history from an ownership model to a service model. So I think something like 95% of all vehicle miles traveled in 2030 will be on-demand vehicle miles. And only 25% of households are projected to have their own cars. So we're going to see a drastic change, and that's very exciting. And I think that automakers actually are essential in leading that change from a manufacturing and supply chain perspective. So I think like 60% of all trips are less than 5 miles. So there's a change that needs to happen with the form factor, and we've seen that happening with e-bikes. So companies like Uber, buying jump bikes, the hot red cherry bike that I rode on the stage in a matching jumper for Jump, and also Lyft buying Motivate. So I was an early hire at Motivate, where I led out technical operations. I care a lot. I care very deeply about Kaizen and lean production, and I think we have a lot to learn there from automakers. Yeah, and I worked with Jump for a bit, helping build out their software. And I was also at Mapbox for a little while, making software as a product manager for last mile logistics and doing some really beautiful stuff in Dash for auto. So yeah, that's me, and I'm really excited to be here today, mainly because I care a lot about the intersection of the know-how of auto and then the nimbleness of tech. So I'm really excited to see how you all are inspired to walk away from this session and do some amazing things there.
Fantastic. And if you could do me a favor and pull your microphone just a little closer to your face so we can all hear you better next time.
Okay.
And with that, let's move on to Ewan, who is the co-founder of Spin. So Ewan, you recently sold Spin for $100 million to the Ford Motor Company. So my first question for you is, given that, are you buying drinks tonight?
Maybe.
My second question is, can you tell us about the background of Spin and sort of where it came from and how you were involved, and why did you end up selling it to Ford?
So 3 years ago, I started Spin. I was living in China at the time, and I spotted the concept of shared bicycles. And this was such a simple, revolutionary product. You had micro vehicles available for access, and it solved such a huge pain point that I saw in cities that I've lived in, whether it's in Vancouver, whether it's in New York, and San Francisco. Uber came on the scene a few years ago, but it didn't really solve the last mile congestion problem, and this was such a simple solution. Teamed up with some friends 3 years ago, we launched in the US. We were the original micromobility provider in the US, and the one big innovation and the founding principle of our company was
and how did you and your friends all come together? Where do you guys know each other from?
We actually were all from Singapore.
From
funny
Singapore?
enough.
Okay.
Yeah.
Singaporean mafia.
Singaporean mafia.
Yeah.
3 software engineers who had a passion for solving problems. And one of the biggest innovations we brought to the space was the concept of working with cities. A key principle, unlike some of the other competitors in the space. I was a former lawyer, and I realized that part of the key to growing this concept was getting the buy-in of cities and working hand in hand with them to design permit systems so that we could actually scale this solution. So a year ago, Ford came to us, and we realized, and we were talking about different ideas of working together, and realized that simply being part of Ford and them aggressively investing in us was really the right concept, and it's proven such a great partnership so far. You might be wondering why Ford, right? Why would Ford be interested in scooters? Well, I think it's 2 prongs of mobility. One, micromobility. Ford was the original mobility company. 111 years ago, they rolled out the Model T. They solved the problem of mobility by making cars affordable then. Clearly, the problem is not affordable cars today. It's too many cars. So micromobility, smaller than car vehicles are the future, and in the future in cities. And the other prong of mobility that they're interested in is mobility as a service, the concept of accessing mobility and not just owning your own car. So lots of exciting stuff happening at the company. Obviously, the recent unveil of the Mach-E and the movie too. There's some fun stuff.
Great, fantastic. Well, I'm sure it's been quite a ride to go from startup to $100 million buyout from one of the world's largest companies. So congratulations on that. With that, let's move on to Dimitri. Dimitri has one of my favorite micromobility companies. It's called Tortoise, and they are doing something that is absolutely brilliant, and if they can pull it off, it will be really game-changing for micromobility. They have autonomous scooters that can drive and reposition themselves, which basically means you don't have to worry about finding your scooter anymore, and you don't have to worry about sending out teams to gather up your scooters. So Dimitri, tell us, how did you come up, what's your background, where did you come from before this, and how did you come up with the concept for Tortoise?
Well, thanks so much for having me here, and it's a pleasure to be here with you all today. It's really exciting to see the convergence of micromobility and transportation and automotive, and we feel really privileged to be a part of it. So my background, I had spent 4 years at Uber, where I led the company's expansion into multimodal transportation, including the partnership and acquisition of Jump Bikes, Uber Transit, Uber Car Rental, so Uber expanding into all the different ways to get people from A to B besides ride hailing. After that great run, I became an advisor to 8 different mobility companies and startups, ranging from scooter operators, scooter hardware makers, companies that are providing data services for cities. Got to see autonomous helicopters, parking, got to see the industry from a lot of different perspectives, and saw 3 really big challenges that were holding micromobility back from realizing its massive potential, which, as Tierney said, is this 60% of private car trips which are under 5 miles. How can we shift those to a more sustainable mode of transportation? So challenge number 1, we all love our scooters and e-bikes, but we all hate when they're in the middle of the sidewalk, cluttering the streets and obstructing public rights of way. So how do you preserve the super fast door-to-door travel time of the dockless model while minimizing this public nuisance and these negative externalities? Second big challenge was 9 days out of 10, when you go out on the street and try to find a scooter, you need to go on a wild goose chase. It happens to be really convenient when it's there, but that's not the happy path. And so how do you take this really enjoyable mode of transportation and make it as reliable as an Uber or Lyft, where you can just press a button on your phone and the vehicle comes to you? And the third big challenge is business model. Spin is very lucky to be part of a large company that can provide subsidy as the industry matures, but I'm sure you've read the headlines about micromobility operators losing tens and hundreds of millions of dollars a year operating their business. And so one of their big operating costs, single biggest daily operating costs, is using people in vans to pick up every scooter and bring it to get recharged and put it back out onto the street.
Great.
And so Tortoise came together trying to solve these 3 big problems.
All right, because you've got an incredible autonomous scooter that basically solves those problems.
Yeah.
We're a little short on time, so I'm going to start collapsing introductions and questions. Tarek. Tarek is an ER doctor who is on the stage talking about micromobility. That may come as a surprise to some of you and not a surprise at all to others of you. But Tarek, could you just tell us a little bit about your study and how you got into this, and what your take is as someone who lives in Santa Monica and has interacted with and also dealt with some of the repercussions of micromobility?
Sure, yeah. Hi, everyone. Again, I'm Tarek Trivedi. I'm an emergency physician. I practice at 2 level 1 trauma centers, one here in Los Angeles at UCLA Health and the other in San Jose. And both are areas where micromobility has really taken off. I moved to Santa Monica in 2017 to start my master's degree in health policy and management. And around the same time, Bird started releasing its scooters in my neighborhood. And one day I woke up on a Saturday and found the scooter and hopped on one myself, downloaded the app, no helmet, nothing. And it wasn't long before I was in the ER working, and I started seeing plenty of injuries and seeing kind of the repercussions of treating micromobility vehicles as toys. So it became clear to us and to myself and my collaborators that we needed to sort of channel the enthusiasm a little bit and maybe put the brakes on it a little bit and say, these are not toys, that they have to be used with care and safety. And so we decided to put a study together where we went through the records in our emergency departments. We had 2 of them with UCLA Health, which saw a majority of the scooter injuries because in West Los Angeles and Santa Monica is pretty much where the rollout was over the first year, from 2017 to 2018. We didn't find anything that would be surprising to most now, that we saw tons and tons of injuries, broken bones, head injuries, and we found that almost no one was wearing a helmet. We found that plenty of people were intoxicated while using the vehicles. And sort of getting that message out there was part of what we were really excited to do. And we think that message has taken a little bit now, especially with as much news coverage and media interest that this study has gotten.
So Tarek, I'm going to stay with you for a second. 2 questions. Is micromobility more dangerous than other modes of transportation today? If so, why? And then how can we make it better? That's really 3 questions. If you can answer in about 15 seconds, I'd appreciate that.
Yeah, right. So the Centers for Disease Control did a quite more of a comprehensive study than we did in Austin, Texas. I don't know if anyone's familiar with that one, but they essentially looked at all 8 ERs that they had in the city, and they looked at all their EMS records, and they found everyone who had gotten injured, and they actually picked up the cell phones and did what we in medicine and epidemiology call good old shoe leather epidemiology, where they knocked on doors and called people and sort of interviewed everyone and found out, what was the reason for your fall, and then they went to the scooter companies and they got the data and said how many trips and how many miles were ridden in total. And what they found was that for every 100,000 miles ridden, they found an average of about 20 injuries, 20 people injured per 100,000 miles ridden. And we think that's probably a conservative estimate, as they probably missed a lot of injuries. But that number probably compares to vehicle accidents at a slightly higher rate. That's what we know so far, but I think that, again, a lot more research is needed. We're in the sort of medicine and public health world big proponents of data sharing agreements with governments and academia. We think that, identifying hotspots and corners where injuries are more likely to happen or accidents are more likely to happen will be really helpful in sort of making micromobility safe for everyone. Now, that being said, I don't own a car in Los Angeles. I ride my e-bike that I rode up here everywhere I go, and I'm still a big fan. But I always wear a helmet, and it's not about preventing the crash. It's if a crash does happen, protect your biggest asset, right?
Yeah, and I think that is so important to walk that line between embracing these new technologies that have so much to offer and really powerful business models, and also realizing that new solutions bring new problems and they have to be dealt with. It seems like one of the biggest solutions, or one of the most powerful solutions to safety and also to some of the other issues confronted by the modern city is increased infrastructure. Ewan, maybe you can tell us a little bit about what some of the infrastructure solutions look like in China and in Singapore and around the world, and where did all of this come from originally?
In terms of the shared micromobility business model, one of the first China and Taiwan, as you mentioned, in China, a few kids basically started sharing their bicycles through the clever use of a text message group and bike combo locks, and this grew into big companies, Ofo and Mobike, which took over and that are still very prevalent over there. And if you see infrastructure overseas and also in some of the leading cities here in North America, like Vancouver, which with its great bike lane network, you'll note that, it is true that infrastructure is the key to literally paving the way for better adoption and safer adoption of micromobility. And some of the things that we're doing on our end include, and also not just for riding, but for operations and decreased clutter on the sidewalk. Mm-hmm. So one of the things that we're rolling out here include charging stations. So a hybrid model where you can park them anywhere, or you can park them at a charging station in exchange for a small rebate. That solves the clutter problem, that solves the charging problem for us as well in a partial way.
So it sounds like this micromobility sector is kind of a brew of entrepreneurship and innovation, but also policy.
Yes.
And that policy plays a really important role. Tierney, what role should policy play?
It's really important. We can't get around it. Policy is the difference between who's allowed to have access to these vehicles and who is not allowed, and therefore has a profound impact on the jobs that they can do. And when you think about movement, you're usually trying to do something. There's a job to be done. So you're really able through a policy to either enable more trips or to have a negative impact on people's ability to take trips. I'm with you.
So if you could just pick 2 or 3 policies that you could wave a magic wand, they could be federal, they could be state, they could be local, what would they be, rapid fire?
Private-public partnerships for shared mobility schemas. I think the public should be on the line for subsidizing these, given the social benefit that we get. The Lund University study that showed that you gain actually 16 cents per kilometer, or 16 euro cents for kilometers traveled on an e-bike, compared to losing 15 euro cents for every kilometer traveled by car. Subsidize it. I think that, 2 other ones. Subsidize personal ownership as well. Mm-hmm. We're already doing that with electric cars. Why not do that with electric private-owned vehicles? And I think, thirdly, think more about marginalized folks like single mothers. I really think we need to get more creative around like e-bikes and passenger laws, and especially in a shared mobility schema, allowing more than one passenger, and also vehicle design. Let's make sure we're designing vehicles that can carry more than one passenger and also the cargo they need to do their jobs.
Great. All right. I'm going to ask Dimitri, I'm going to ask you one question, then we're going to open up and see if we can take one or two questions from the audience. So you guys are building an autonomous scooter. That sounds very complicated. It sounds very expensive. Tell me how that is possibly going to work.
Well, the key is it's never going to be fully autonomous. So it's always a combination of remote teleoperators. So think like a drone operator who handles the hard parts of a trip, and autonomy software. But the real advantage that we're working with is we've just lived through the smartphone peace dividend. So all the cameras and components inside our smartphones have gotten 10 times more powerful while getting 10 times cheaper. And we're essentially taking those same cameras and components and putting them on the outside of a scooter. So it actually only takes $100 in extra hardware to take a typical two-wheel kick scooter that you see on the street and make it compatible with Tortoise's automated repositioning service.
And based on kind of a normal use cycle, how long would it take to sort of buy back that investment in hardware and technology?
5 days.
5 days.
Because right now, scooters on the streets are grossly underutilized. So they're sitting empty 80% of the time, and MIT did a study that you can get 10 times more utilization out of your fleet if it's dynamically repositioning throughout the day.
So let's do a raise of hands on the panel. How many of you would make an investment that you could earn back in 5 days? Personally, I would make that investment. So best of luck to Dimitri. Okay, let's take a couple of questions from the audience. I will look for hands. I see one in the front over here. There's a microphone coming your way.
Hi, Louis Seiden. One of the problems I see facing shared micromobility solutions is theft. There was a piece on the news the other night about e-bikes being stolen in LA at an alarming rate. They are micro and they are mobile. What do you guys propose? The city leaders are looking at that with a discerning eye.
So I would direct that question towards Tyranny because she has a lot of operational experience. How do you deal with theft?
Increase access to e-bikes for more people so that they don't have to steal them to have access to them.
That's an interesting solution. All right, one more question. Hands, anyone? There's one in the back here on the right-hand side.
Hi there. Just as a personal anecdote, I've been using scooters here in LA. They're not allowed in London, where I come from. And I feel very insecure on the roads, with the little wheels and the little potholes, and I'm cycling, and I'm all very tense, and I wondered what your comments were about that.
Yeah, honestly, I have been taking the one wheel around downtown LA for the last 24 hours, and some of the bike lanes are pretty good, and some of them not so much. It's very difficult to ride these small-wheeled vehicles on roads that have potholes and have big seams in them. So I think we're all agreed the infrastructure is a huge part of the solution.
I have a number on this too, which is for every mile in San Francisco, People Protected did a study. It's $500,000 for a mile, a really good protected bike lane, and $500 million for your regular arterial a mile across that. So
that's
it's kind of a no-brainer just to invest in safer infrastructure so that we reduce friction and trip taking, we improve safety. And yeah, I'm sorry to hear about your experience. I hope that you find a beautiful bike path to bike.
Hopefully we can get you some better bike lanes.
The other quick thought there is we're at the beginning of a Cambrian explosion of new light electric vehicle hardware form factors. And so I'd expect three-wheel scooters, four-wheel scooters, scooters that are designed for elderly people. It's all coming, and don't be too focused on what they currently look like today.
Yeah.
That's a great point, and I'm sure improved infrastructure makes micromobility safer. It probably makes your job easier, Dimitri. It probably makes everyone's job easier up here. So we are out of time, unfortunately, but I'm going to do real quickly one sentence from each of you guys down the line. What is the last thing that you want to leave the audience with that they should know about micromobility? Let's go backwards. Start with you, Tarek.
Avoid being intoxicated on micromobility devices and try to wear helmets when possible.
Don't get drunk and drive on micromobility either. Thank you.
get ready to press a button on your phone and have a scooter drive itself to you.
Great.
Nice. Vehicle design is so important. Automakers, please start designing some small vehicles for jobs to be done. I'm really excited to see what's going to happen with this Cambrian explosion you talked about.
And finally,
And if you think back about 100 years ago when horses and cars and people all shared dirt roads without infrastructure, that's where micromobility is today.
Yeah.
It's so far from being where it's going to go, and we're so excited to keep pushing it forward.
yeah, absolutely. I mean, micromobility is not perfect. There are going to be some bumps along the road as we roll it out. But if you think back to after World War II, more people died in auto accidents in the 8 years following World War I than actually died in World War I on the American side. So it's not too bad compared to some things that we've been through before. So anyway, thank you everyone for being here. Thank you everyone for your thoughtful comments, and we hope that all of you guys jump on a micromobility device and get to know a piece of our world.